The structure rising behind Niels Ostergaard's cabin looked wild, as if the forest were reclaiming the sawn planks. By October of 1873, while every other settler in the Chequamegon Valley was chinking their walls tighter against the coming winter, Niels was covering his with shaggy layers of hemlock bark. From the river road, it looked like the cabin had grown a pelt. It was wrong. It was messy. It was, according to the sawmill foreman, an open invitation to rot and insects. By spring, 3 families had copied him. The settlement was a tan bark and lumber town, 90 households strung along the river, a mix of Yankee ambition and Scandinavian stubbornness. News traveled by the shriek of the mill whistle and the talk on the Saturday scaler's bench. And on that bench, every Saturday from September on, the foreman, Whitcomb, held court. "It's beetle bait," he'd say, loud enough for Niels to hear from the provision store. Worse, it's fire tinder. He's building his family a coffin and calling it a house. The criticism was sharp because it came from a place of experience. 23 winters Whitcomb had seen in these woods. He knew timber, and he knew that loose bark was a home for carpenter ants and a sponge for water. He'd seen a bark-sided ice house in Ashland come apart in '71. The sheathing behind it turned to black mulch. Niels Ostergaard was a fool, plain and simple. But the question that hung in the cold autumn air, unspoken by all but felt by many, was why a man so quiet and so careful would do something so recklessly, visibly foolish. Why would he wrap his home in the one part of a tree every sawyer knew to discard first? Before we peel back the layers on Niels Ostergaard's strange creation, and before we stand with Whitcomb on that frozen river road in the heart of a brutal winter, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Stories of forgotten ingenuity are what we do here, and I promise that by the end of this one, you will understand how 2 layers of empty air can hold more warmth than a foot of solid wood, and how knowledge passed down on a snowy afternoon can change everything. If you've ever had an idea that others called foolish, let us know in the comments what it was. Niels Ostergaard was not a carpenter. He was not a sawyer. And he certainly wasn't a frontiersman in the way the Yankee settlers understood the term. He was a bark man. For 9 years, from the time he was a boy until he left Manitowoc, he had worked for the Sheboygan tanneries, stripping hemlock. His world was not the clean geometry of the sawmill, but the living skin of the forest. His tools were the spud knife, the axe, and the peeling iron. His hands knew the heft and curl of bark, the subtle difference in weight between a sheet peeled in June and one taken in September. He carried the mark of that trade on his left hand. The little finger was a half-inch short, the tip taken clean off by a slip of the spud knife one icy morning. The accident had taught him a new way to grip. When he held a cup or an axe handle, he instinctively threaded the shortened finger behind the others, a small, private accommodation to a permanent loss. It was a gesture of quiet competence, a man who had adapted to the world as it was, not as he wished it to be. He had brought his wife Hilda and their young son Peter to the Chequamegon country 2 years earlier. With them came Hilda's father, Soren, a man whose body had been broken by a fall in the Manitowoc mill yard. Soren was a giant of a man, laid low. He lived his life in a bed built into the corner of their small cabin, his world defined by the 4 walls around him. The doctor had been clear. The damage to his spine was absolute. He could not be moved, not to a warmer room, not to a different town, not ever. The family was anchored to this spot by the weight of Soren's stillness. The walls of the cabin had to be enough. Their first winter, 1872, proved they were not. It was a brutal education in the physics of cold. Niels had built their cabin like everyone else, with tight-fitted pine planks and chinking made of clay and grass. It was a good, solid cabin by local standards. But the cold didn't care about standards. It was a physical force, relentless and invasive. It found every pinhole, every seam. The latch iron on the door bit through mitten wool with a searing cold. Pater's cup of milk, left on the table overnight, would have a ring of ice in it by morning. For Soren, it was a quiet agony. He lay in his corner bed, the one farthest from the stove, and the cold settled around him like a shroud. By dawn, the quilt at the foot of his bed would be stiff with frost, the moisture of his own breath frozen in the fabric. Niels and Hilda burned through a cord of wood every 10 days, a staggering amount of labor for so little comfort. The stove roared red hot, creating a small circle of habitable space, while 3 feet away, the air remained frigid. The single-plank walls were a sieve, leaking heat as fast as the fire could produce it. Niels knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that they could not survive another winter like that. Soren could not. The answer did not come from a book or a builder. It came from a memory, from an afternoon spent on a frozen lake near Lac du Flambeau. Niels had been hunting and had come across an Anishinaabe elder named Gabe Nabeck, who was preparing birch bark for a winter wigwam. Niels, ever curious about the properties of bark, had stopped to watch. Gabe laid 2 wide sheets of the pale bark on the snow. He pointed with a worn mitten. He explained that the bark had a grain, a direction of growth, just like wood. For a summer lodge, you could lay it any way. But for a winter lodge, the one that had to shed snow and hold warmth, you overlapped the sheets grain down, so that moisture would flow over the seams, not into them. He showed Niels how the bark, when peeled in the cold months, had a natural, gentle cup to its shape. By laying them grain down, the cups nested, creating a continuous, waterproof skin. It was a simple piece of knowledge, passed on quietly from one man to another on a bed of snow. One man saw a building material. The other saw the living skin of a shelter. That afternoon stuck with Niels. He had the tanner's knowledge of hemlock, and now the wigwam builder's knowledge of birch. In his mind, the two began to stitch themselves together. The problem with a conventional cabin was not simply that it was thin. It was that it fought the winter with a single, brittle defense. The settlers of Chequamegon, like settlers everywhere, put their faith in mass and tight seals. They believed the enemy was the wind, the draft. Their solution was to stuff every crack with chinking, a mixture of clay, sand, and dried grass. In September, this felt like a victory. The walls were tight, the drafts were gone. But winter undoes such victories with relentless, silent physics. The warm, moist air inside the cabin, from breath, from cooking, from boiling water for laundry, carried a heavy load of water vapor. This vapor, driven by a pressure gradient, migrated outward, seeking the colder, drier air. It passed easily through the wooden planks, but when it reached the inner surface of the frozen chinking, it stopped. The temperature there was below the dew point. The vapor condensed into liquid water, soaking the clay and grass. Then, as the temperature continued to drop, that liquid water froze into ice. Ice is a powerful engine of destruction. It expands with a force of thousands of pounds per square inch. Day after day, the cycle repeated. Moisture migrated, condensed, and froze. The ice crystals grew, pushing apart the particles of clay, shredding the fibers of grass. By January, the chinking was no longer a solid barrier. It was a pulverized, porous mass, riddled with micro fissures. Now the wind had its entry. A 20-mile-per-hour wind in 10-degree weather could suck the heat out of a cabin in minutes, forcing the stove to burn twice as hard, just to keep the room temperature from plummeting. Every family in the valley knew this failure intimately. They saw it as dark patches of frost on the interior walls. They felt it as a constant ankle-level draft that no amount of rolled-up rags could stop. They heard it in the way the wind would make the candle flames dance on the table. Their homes were engaged in a constant, losing battle, trading tons of firewood for a few degrees of warmth. Whitcomb, the sawmill foreman, lived in a house praised for its construction. His planks were thicker, his joints were tighter, his foundation was stone. Yet even he fought the same battle. He simply had better armor. The enemy was the same. The fundamental flaw was the design itself. A single wall, no matter how thick or how well sealed, was still just one barrier against the immense, unceasing cold of a Wisconsin winter. It was like trying to stop a river with a single dam. Sooner or later, the pressure would find a way through. Niels Ostergaard understood this. He had watched the frost form on Soren's blanket. He had measured the cords of wood, disappearing from his pile. He knew another layer of chinking wouldn't solve the problem. The problem wasn't the chinking. It was the wall. The very idea of the wall was wrong. He wasn't going to seal the cracks. He was going to build a new skin for the entire house, one that understood the nature of water and air. In late August of 1873, with the memory of the first winter still raw, Niels began his work. The town watched. He didn't start with lumber from Whitcomb's mill. He started in the swamps, carefully peeling vast sheets of birch bark from fallen trees. He handled them with a reverence that seemed strange to the loggers who saw him, carrying the pale, flexible sheets back to his cabin and laying them out to flatten under stones. This was his vapor barrier, the lesson from Gabe Nabeck. Next, he went into the hemlock stands. He wasn't logging, he was harvesting. He chose trees of a specific diameter, and with his spud knife and axe, he stripped the bark in long, uniform plates. He knew from his years in the tannery trade that late summer bark had a particular quality. It held its shape, a slight concave cup, as it dried. This was not a flaw. To Niels, this was its purpose. He began cladding the north wall first, the one that took the brunt of the winter wind. He nailed the birch bark sheets directly to the cabin's plank wall, overlapping them just as Gabe had shown him, grain down. The cabin looked peculiar now, wrapped in a paper-like skin. Then came the part that baffled everyone. He nailed vertical wood battens, 5 inches deep, over the birch bark. He was building a void, a deliberate 5-inch gap of empty space around his entire home. Whitcomb rode by on the river road one afternoon, reining up his horse. "What's the gap for, Ostergaard?" he called out. "Planning to store the wind for summer?" Niels was on his ladder, a pouch of nails around his waist. He looked down, his face calm. "It's for keeping things dry," he said, and turned back to his work. Then he started hanging the hemlock shingles. This was the signature moment, the movement that held all his knowledge. He would take a plate of bark, feeling its weight and texture. He'd turn it over in his hands, his shortened left finger threading behind the others as he gripped it, testing the curve of the bark against his palm. Finding the natural cup, he'd place it on the wall, grain side out, cup side down, and nail it to the battens. Each piece overlapped the one below it like shingles on a roof. He worked in 3 staggered courses so that no vertical seam ever aligned. The cabin began to transform. The clean lines of the plank walls disappeared under a thick, textured hide. It was dark, rough, and deeply strange. It no longer looked like a product of the sawmill. It looked like something that had grown in place, an ancient armored creature hunkered down for a long winter. The other settlers would slow their wagons as they passed. It was unsettling. It broke every rule of frontier construction, which prized neatness, tight joints, and the clean look of sawn lumber. The talk at the scaler's bench grew louder. Whitcomb, backed by his 2 decades of experience, laid out the case against it. "I've seen this before," he declared one Saturday, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "That bark is full of sugars. The carpenter ants will be in there by May. The first driving rain, water will get behind those loose plates and sit against his sheathing. It'll never dry out in that gap he's built. By the second summer, the planks underneath will be rotten. He's insulating his house with a sponge. He cited his proof, the story that sealed his argument. They built an ice house in Ashland with bark sides back in '69. Said it would be cheaper. By '71, you could push a fist through the wall. It came apart. This is settled knowledge. The other men nodded. It made sense. Whitcomb was the foreman. He knew wood. And the Ashland ice house was a fact. Niels, who sometimes came to the bench to listen, never argued. He would stand at the edge of the group, his gaze distant, his damaged hand resting on his knee. He would listen to the confident pronouncements of his failure, give a small, non-committal nod, and then walk away to continue his work. His silence was mistaken for shame or foolishness. It was, in fact, the deep calm of a man who knew a different set of facts, learned not from sawmills, but from the forest itself. By the first snowfall in November, the cabin was fully encased. It looked wild. It looked wrong. And it was ready. What Whitcomb and the others saw as a shaggy, water-trapping mess was, in reality, a sophisticated, multi-layered system designed to manage moisture and air with remarkable efficiency. Niels had built what modern science would call a ventilated rainscreen. Its genius lay in understanding that the enemy was not just cold, but the water that cold could manipulate. The system worked in 3 distinct layers. The first layer, the outer hemlock bark shingles, was the raincoat. Its job was simple: to shed the vast majority of liquid water from rain and melting snow. Because Niels had oriented the natural cup of the bark downward and overlapped the pieces, water flowed from shingle to shingle and down to the ground. The rough, thick bark was highly durable and water-resistant. It was the cabin's first and most obvious line of defense. But no raincoat is perfect. Under the pressure of a driving wind, some moisture would inevitably find its way past the outer layer. This is where Whitcomb's prediction, based on the Ashland ice house, should have come true. He believed this trapped water would soak the underlying wall, but he missed the crucial element, the 5-inch air gap Niels had built. This was the second layer, and it was the heart of the invention. This was not dead air in the sense of being sealed. It was a ventilated cavity. Small gaps at the bottom and top allowed air to move through it, driven by convection. Any moisture that got behind the hemlock shingles was not trapped. It simply clung to the back of the bark or the front of the battens, exposed to a continuous, gentle flow of air. This airflow encouraged rapid evaporation. The water turned back into vapor and was carried away before it could ever condense or soak into the main wall of the cabin. Furthermore, this large 5-inch column of relatively still air acted as a powerful insulator. Air is a poor conductor of heat. By creating such a wide gap, Niels had wrapped his house in a thermal blanket that was almost entirely weightless. The bark itself, with a density of only about 12 pounds per cubic foot, was also a decent insulator, but its primary job was shedding rain. The heavy lifting of insulation was done by the air. The third layer was the birch bark, nailed directly to the cabin's plank sheathing. This was the vapor barrier. Whitcomb worried about water getting in from the outside, but Niels knew the greater danger in a cold climate was water trying to get out from the inside. The air inside the heated cabin, full of moisture from breathing, cooking, and Soren's very presence, was constantly trying to escape. In a standard cabin, this moisture-laden air would pass through the plank walls and condense on the first cold surface it met, turning the wall cavity into a damp, frosty mess that promoted rot. The thin, impermeable sheets of birch bark stopped this process completely. The warm, moist interior air hit the birch bark and could go no further. It remained as vapor on the warm side of the wall, never reaching a surface cold enough to condense upon. Together, The 3 layers created a system that was far more than the sum of its parts. The hemlock shed the rain. The air gap dried what got through and provided insulation. The birch bark stopped interior moisture from rotting the walls from the inside out. Niels had built a wall that could breathe, a wall that understood the physics of water in all its forms: liquid, ice, and vapor. He had wrapped his home not in a sponge, but in a lung. The first snows of November came gently. The cabin felt different. The ever-present drafts were gone. The floor near the walls was no longer noticeably colder. The stove seemed to consume wood at a slower, more measured pace. Hilda noticed she could sit and mend clothes by the window, her fingers not stiffening with cold. Young Peter could play with his wooden blocks on the floor without needing to be wrapped in a heavy blanket. For Soren, the change was profound. The biting chill that had seeped into his corner was gone. The air around his bed was still and calm. For the first time in a year, the quilt at his feet remained soft and dry through the night. Niels would check the water pitcher on the small table beside Soren's bed each morning. It remained liquid. These were small proofs, quiet victories against the creeping cold. But the true test, the one that would validate the wild-looking exterior, was yet to come. It arrived in the second week of January. The weather turned unnaturally warm, a silver thaw that brought a day of freezing rain. It coated every surface, every tree branch, every roof, every fence post, in a half-inch thick glaze of clear, solid ice. Then overnight the temperature plummeted. The sky cleared, the wind died, and an Arctic high-pressure system settled over the region, locking it in a deep, bitter cold. For 11 days, the temperature never rose above 10 degrees below zero. For 5 of those days, the nights dropped to between -17 degrees Fahrenheit and -28 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a still, suffocating cold, a cold that seemed to leach the life from the very air. With no wind, the smoke from the chimneys of Chequamegon rose in straight, unwavering columns, the only sign of the desperate battle for warmth being waged below. The town suffered. The ice-coated trees groaned and cracked in the deep cold, the sound like pistol shots in the frozen silence. Woodpiles vanished at an alarming rate. The constant ringing of axes echoed across the valley as men were forced to cut and split more wood in the brutal temperatures, their breath freezing in clouds before their faces. Families with less seasoned wood or less tightly built cabins were forced to huddle together, abandoning colder rooms and living entirely within a few feet of their stoves. The mill shut down, the river was frozen too thick to work. There was nothing to do but feed the fire and wait. Inside Niels Ostergaard's cabin, a strange normalcy prevailed. The difference was not loud, but quiet. The stove was not roaring. It was fed a steady, conservative diet of oak and maple. It burned with a low, consistent heat. The interior temperature held at a steady 57 degrees, a comfortable, livable warmth. While their neighbors were burning through a cord of wood in a week, Niels's carefully stacked pile seemed to shrink at a glacial pace. He had used just over half a cord since the first snowfall. He calculated he had enough to last until April. The domestic warmth was palpable in small, impossible details. Hilda could hang wet laundry on a line strung across the room, and it would actually dry overnight instead of freezing stiff. Peter's toys, left on the floor, were cool to the touch, but not painfully cold. And every morning, the ultimate proof sat on the table by Soren's bed: the water pitcher. In every other house in the valley, a pitcher of water left away from the stove would be a solid block of ice by dawn, needing to be broken with the handle of a spoon. In Soren's corner, the coldest part of the cabin, the water poured clear and clean every single morning. The cold had been defeated not by a bigger fire, but by a smarter wall. The cabin was no longer a sieve leaking heat into the frozen world. It was a vessel, holding its warmth intact. On the 6th day of the Arctic lock, the sun was a pale, useless disk in the white sky. The temperature at noon was 22 degrees below zero. Whitcomb, the sawmill foreman, was out on the river road with his team of horses. He was bundled in wool and buffalo hide, the cold so intense it felt like a physical weight. He was heading downriver to check the mill's water intake, worried the deep freeze would crack the cast iron housing. He passed the small cluster of cabins on the bend, his mind occupied with the mechanics of ice and iron. But his woodsman's eyes registered a familiar sight, the signature of every homestead in a deep freeze. From the roof of each cabin, a dark, ugly ring had melted the snow away from the chimney stack. The melt extended 2, sometimes 3 feet out from the stone or brick. It was a clear and unambiguous sign of escaping heat. The warmth from the stove, meant for the family inside, was pouring through the ceiling and roof boards, wasting itself into the frozen air. Whitcomb had seen this on thousands of roofs over 23 winters. It was as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. It was the price of survival. Then his gaze fell upon Niels Ostergaard's place. He stopped his team. The horses stood with their heads low, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Whitcomb stared. His mind, accustomed to a lifetime of observing the behavior of wood and heat and snow, could not process what he was seeing. Ostergaard's roof was a perfect, seamless blanket of white. 14 inches of snow lay across it, smooth and undisturbed from ridge to eave. There was no melt ring around the chimney, not a dark spot, not a hint of moisture. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the flue, but below it, the snow lay as pristine and frozen as it did in the deepest parts of the forest. It was impossible. It meant that almost no heat was escaping through the roof. It meant the warmth was being held inside the house with an efficiency he had never imagined possible. He sat on his sleigh for a long minute, the cold forgotten. Every principle of construction he had ever known was based on the fact that heat rises and escapes. A house in winter was a wounded thing, constantly bleeding its warmth into the sky. Yet here was a house that held its own. The shaggy, wild-looking bark walls that he had mocked, that he had confidently predicted would fail, were somehow connected to this impossible sight. He had criticized the walls, but the proof was on the roof. The entire structure was a system, and it was a system that worked. 23 winters in these woods, and he had never seen a January roof keep its snow whole. He didn't need to knock on the door. He didn't need to feel the warmth inside. The snow told the entire story. The cabin wore the winter like a coat, not a wound. Without a word, Whitcomb clucked to his horses, turned the sleigh around, and headed back to town. He had been so certain of the problem, but he had been looking at the wrong part of the tree. When the Arctic lock finally broke, the valley thawed into a state of communal exhaustion. The primary topic of conversation was fuel. Men compared how many cords they had burned through, who had run out, who had been forced to start on their green wood. The cost of those 11 days was measured in aching backs and depleted wood piles. The following Saturday, the scaler's bench was crowded. The men were recounting their struggles, a shared narrative of hardship. Whitcomb was there, but he was unusually quiet. Niels Ostergaard arrived to buy flour and salt and stood at the edge of the group as he always did. One of the sawyers turned to the foreman. "I reckon you burned through a fair bit yourself, Whitcomb, even with that fine house of yours." Whitcomb didn't answer right away. He looked past the sawyer, his eyes finding Niels. For a moment, the two men held a gaze across the small crowd. The foreman's face, usually set in lines of confident authority, was different. It held a look of grudging respect. "Ask him," Whitcomb said, his voice quiet but clear, nodding toward Niels. "He's the one who's figured it out." A silence fell over the bench. All eyes turned to Niels. Whitcomb's statement was more than a deferral. It was a public concession, an admission of error from the most respected timberman in the valley. Later, Whitcomb approached the scaler, a man whose job was measurement and fact. He didn't talk about the bark or the ants. He described in precise detail the snow on Ostergaard's roof. He spoke of the complete absence of a melt ring at 20 below zero. The scaler, a man who dealt in numbers, understood the implications immediately. An intact snow blanket was a perfect calorimeter. It was data. The story spread, now legitimized by Whitcomb's reversal. It was no longer the tale of a fool, but the tale of a mystery. Men started stopping by Niels' cabin, not to mock, but to look. They'd walk around it, touching the rough bark, peering at the overlapping joints, trying to understand the simple mechanics of what they saw. Niels, in his quiet way, answered their questions. He showed them the layers, explained the air gap, and recounted the lesson of the birch bark. He shared his knowledge as freely as it had been shared with him. By March, with the snow still deep but the days growing longer, the first imitation appeared. 3 families from a nearby lumber camp, who lived in poorly built shacks and had suffered terribly during the cold snap, decided to try it. They had ready access to hemlock bark, a waste product of their work. They spent their Sundays cladding the north walls of their cabins, just as Niels had done. The effect was immediate. Even in the waning days of winter, their shacks held the heat of the stove for hours longer. The news traveled. That May, the Manitowoc Pilot ran a column under the headline, "A Wisconsin Innovation in Warmth," detailing Niels Ostergaard's method and citing the fuel savings. The wild cabin was no longer an object of ridicule. It was the prototype of a new kind of frontier shelter, born from ancient knowledge and immediate necessity. What Niels Ostergaard had built on the banks of the Chequamegon River was not just a curiosity. Modern building science would give it a formal name, a back-ventilated, drained, and dried rainscreen assembly with a dedicated inboard air and vapor control layer. Today, it is recognized as the most effective and durable way to build a wall in a cold, wet climate. The principles Niels deployed, of shedding bulk water, drying incidental moisture, stopping air leakage, and controlling vapor drive, are now the gold standard for high-performance construction around the world. Niels Ostergaard did not set out to be an inventor. His ambition was smaller and far more profound. He was a son-in-law, charged with the care of a man who could not move. Soren, lying in his corner bed, could not walk to the stove to warm his hands. He could not add another log to the fire. He was a prisoner of the cold that seeped through the walls of their home. Niels looked at that problem and saw that the only solution was to make the walls themselves a source of comfort. He had to bring the warmth to Soren, the layers of bark, the strange air gap, the wild and shaggy appearance of his home. None of it was for show or for the sake of being different. It was an act of quiet devotion. Each nail driven, each shingle placed, was part of a promise to a man trapped in stillness. The world saw a foolish experiment. Niels was building a fortress of duty. He built walls that kept faith with a man who could no longer walk to them, proving that the most powerful innovations often come not from a desire for fame, but from the simple human need to care for one another. If you found this story of quiet ingenuity valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier of human resilience. Every subscription helps us uncover and share these important histories. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.